The first time Marcus saw the muddy footprints on his roof, he thought it was a dream. He was making coffee at 6 in the morning, still groggy, when he happened to glance out the kitchen window toward the backyard. The October sun was just breaking through the trees, casting long shadows across the yard, and that's when he noticed them. Small, grimy prints trailing across the white tile of his roof, leading from the big oak tree near the property line straight to his bedroom window. Marcus set down his mug with a deliberately careful motion, the kind of movement people make when they're afraid something fragile might break. He was 34 years old, a software architect who worked from home most days, and he lived in the kind of neighborhood where people waved and meant it, where the biggest drama of the year was usually someone's HOA violation. The footprints didn't fit that world. They were too small, too deliberate, and they made his stomach tighten. He grabbed his phone and went outside, taking photos from different angles. The prints were definitely fresh. The morning dew still clung to them. Small sneakers, maybe size 4 or 5, kids, someone's kids had been on his roof. The logical explanation came first. They'd probably been playing, gotten lost in the game, climbed the wrong tree. It happened. He'd done worse as a kid. Marcus went back inside, made a mental note to trim the oak tree, and tried to focus on his work. He had a code review at 10. The footprints nagged at him anyway, a small, persistent itch he couldn't quite scratch. That evening, he called the non-emergency police line. The dispatcher was kind but clearly unimpressed. Kids on a roof, no damage, no threats. It was barely a blip on their radar. They suggested he talk to his neighbors, trim the tree, maybe install some motion sensor lights. Standard stuff. Marcus thanked her and hung up feeling both reassured and oddly abandoned. He didn't see the footprints again for almost 2 weeks. Then he found them again on a Saturday morning, and this time they were accompanied by something worse. A muddy handprint on his bedroom window, small enough to fit in his palm, accompanied by a streaky nose print. Someone had pressed their face against the glass. This time Marcus didn't hesitate. He marched through his house, out the front door, and toward the oak tree with his phone in hand. He stood under the branches, looking up at the rough bark, at the way the lowest branch hung directly over his roof like an invitation. He could see the scuff marks on the trunk where small shoes had found purchase. The houses in this neighborhood were set back on modest lots, separated by 6-foot fences that people respected more out of habit than actual enforcement. His neighbor on the right was the Hendersons, sweet, older couple who'd moved in 3 years ago. On the left was the Kellers with their teenage son who played video games at volumes that Marcus could hear through the walls. Behind him, across the back fence, was where he knew less. The houses were visible from his kitchen window, but he'd only waved at the occupants a handful of times. He walked to the side of his house and stood on his fence, peering over into the back neighbor's yard. It was the kind of yard that spoke volumes, toys scattered everywhere in various states of abandonment, a trampoline with a hole in the netting, a sandbox that looked like it hadn't been maintained in months, a plastic playhouse in the corner, pink and faded. This was the house with kids. This was where they'd come from. Marcus climbed down from the fence, feeling something shift in his chest. A decision was forming, the kind that would mark the beginning of a chain of events neither he nor anyone else would want. He knocked on the gate, which wasn't locked. He walked through into the backyard, which opened up to him like a stage set of neglect and chaos. He could hear kids inside the house, their voices shrill with some kind of argument. He knocked on the back door. It opened with the kind of speed that suggested his knock had been the excuse someone was looking for. The woman who answered the door was probably in her early 40s, wearing yoga pants and a stained sweater, her blonde hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her forehead. She had the look of someone whose day was already a disaster before it had truly begun. "Yes," she said, her eyes scanning him with a wariness that Marcus found interesting. "Hi," he said, keeping his voice friendly. "I'm Marcus. I live behind you, the house with the blue door." Her expression didn't change. "Karen, what's wrong?" "There have been some kids on my roof," he said, watching her face. "Multiple times now, I found muddy footprints, and they've been looking in my windows." He saw the moment it landed. Her jaw tightened, her eyes flicked away to something behind him, then back. "My kids don't go on your roof," she said flatly. Marcus had prepared for this. "I have photos, time-stamped photos, and the prints are pretty distinctive. They come from that oak tree which is on my property." "Kids play," Karen said, her voice taking on an edge. "If your tree is attracting them, that's something you should deal with." Something hot bloomed in Marcus's chest. "They're trespassing on my property. Looking in my bedroom window, that's not a normal thing kids do. My kids aren't delinquents, KARENS said, and now she was angry, her face flushing. If you're accusing them of something, you need to talk to me with actual proof, not theories. I have proof, Marcus said, holding up his phone. I have photos of... I don't care, KARENS interrupted, and she moved to close the door. Don't come into my yard accusing my children of anything. If you have a real problem, call the police. Otherwise, leave us alone. The door shut with a finality that made Marcus's ears ring. He stood there for a moment, the autumn breeze cool against his face, and realized he'd made a mistake. Not in confronting her, that impulse had been reasonable. The mistake was believing that a direct conversation would resolve anything. He'd just confirmed in KARENS' mind that he was a problem, a threat, an unreasonable neighbor making accusations about innocent children. He turned and walked back through her yard, through the gate, and into his own property. Behind him, he heard her lock the gate with a sharp click. That night, he installed motion sensor lights on the back of his house, expensive ones with night vision and recording capability. Then he called a tree service and scheduled the oak tree to be trimmed back away from his roof. It would cost him $900 and take a week to schedule. He paid for the priority service anyway. He didn't see any footprints for 3 days. On the 4th day, he was working at his desk when his motion sensor light flickered on. He checked the recording and felt his blood go cold. 2 kids, one maybe 8 or 9 years old, one younger, 6 at most, were on his roof. They moved with the deliberate speed of children who knew they were doing something they shouldn't. The older one carried something. It looked like a ball. They were playing up there, literally playing on his roof like it was a jungle gym. The footage was time-stamped, 4:47 p.m. Marcus watched them crouch and move, watched the smaller one nearly slip on a section of loose tile, watched the older one grab them and pull them back. His hands were shaking when the light went off again. He grabbed his phone and called the police non-emergency line again. This time he had footage. The dispatcher seemed more interested. They said an officer would come by to take a statement. Marcus waited, watching the video over and over, documenting the trespass with the obsessive precision of someone who needed evidence to be absolutely, undeniably clear. Officer Patricia Rivera arrived 40 minutes later. She was in her 50s, with gray threading through her dark hair and the kind of bearing that suggested she'd seen enough of the world to be unimpressed by most of it. She watched the footage in Marcus's living room, her expression remaining neutral throughout. "You've trimmed the tree?" she asked when it was finished. "Tree service is scheduled for next week. I got them to prioritize." "Good. Did you talk to the neighbor about this?" Marcus told her about his conversation with KARENS. Officer Rivera made notes on a small pad and then looked at him with eyes that suggested she already knew how this would end. "I can't arrest kids for trespassing based on footage," she said carefully. "But I can go talk to the parents, make it official. Sometimes that carries more weight than a conversation." "Please," Marcus said. Officer Rivera came back 3 hours later with an update. She found him in his yard, hanging a new camera that covered more of the roof. "I spoke with KARENS Martinez," Rivera said, and something in her tone told him this hadn't gone well. "She says her kids didn't do it, says there are other families in the neighborhood, and she resents the implication." "The footage shows." "I know what the footage shows, but she's denying it. Without catching them in the act, I don't have a legal leg to stand on. My recommendation is the tree service and maybe some additional security measures, and try to be neighborly. These things blow over faster if they don't escalate." But it was already escalating. Marcus could feel it like pressure building in a sealed room. 2 days later, his car was keyed. A long, deliberate scratch down the driver's side, so deep that the bare metal showed. No note, no explanation, just violence. He reported it to the police, and Officer Rivera came back out. She looked sympathetic but unsurprised. "Probably not anything I can prove," she said, examining the damage. "Could have been anyone, there's no video. The motion sensors don't cover the driveway." "Might want to expand that," Rivera suggested gently. The tree service came on a Thursday. They trimmed the oak so severely that it looked skeletal, removing the branches that had provided the perfect bridge to his roof. It cost $900 and achieved, Marcus hoped, the elimination of the problem. But something in him knew it wouldn't be that simple. He was right. On Sunday, he found rocks on his roof. Not pieces of gravel, actual rocks collected from someone's yard arranged in a pattern. They weren't there for decoration. The message was implicit: we can still get up here. We can do what we want. Marcus photographed everything and sat down at his kitchen table with his coffee, watching it get cold. A thought occurred to him that he'd been avoiding. What if this wasn't about the kids anymore? What if this was about Karen? What if everything he did to protect himself just made her angrier? He thought about what Officer Rivera had said: try to be neighborly, try to make it blow over. He typed out a message to Karen's phone number, which he'd gotten from the neighborhood directory. It took him 20 minutes to find exactly the right words: apologetic without being submissive, reasonable without being weak. Hi Karen, I'm sorry our first conversation was so confrontational. I should have approached it differently. I've trimmed the tree and added security cameras, mostly for my own peace of mind. I hope we can just move forward as neighbors. If there's anything I can do to smooth things over, let me know. Marcus. He stared at the message for a full minute before hitting send. 3 hours later, he got a response: don't contact me again. That night, Marcus lay in bed listening to his house settle, to the small creaks and groans that come with winter approaching. He thought about the kids, about Karen, about the fundamental mistake of assuming that good intentions and reasonable behavior would be rewarded with the same. The footprints on his roof, the handprint on his window, the keyed car, the rocks, they formed a narrative that made him feel like an intruder in his own life. The rocks became a nightly deposit. Some mornings he'd wake up to find them arranged in increasingly creative patterns, patterns that almost looked like words, almost looked like accusations. He photographed each one and uploaded them to a secure folder. The digital documentation became his religion, his way of preserving a record of what was happening, even though he had no idea what he'd ultimately do with that record. The motion sensor light captured footage of the kids multiple times. They'd learned to avoid the peak of the roof, but they still got up there, still played, still tested the boundaries of what they could do. The older one, who Marcus realized was probably Karen's son, maybe 10 years old, started bringing other kids. A neighborhood crew. It became a dare, apparently, a challenge to get onto the crazy neighbor's roof without getting caught. Marcus installed additional cameras. He secured his chimney cap. He strung fishing line across the most accessible parts of the roof, the kind that would be visible at roof level but not noticeable from the ground. It wasn't dangerous. It was just a deterrent, a boundary maker. But the second time the kids encountered it, they cut it down with what looked like a kitchen knife. That's when Marcus realized that Karen was escalating too. She was encouraging them. He found evidence on the neighborhood Facebook group. He wasn't a member, but his friend Daniel Chen had mentioned it and sent him a screenshot. It was a post by someone named Karen M. that read, "Some people think they own the whole neighborhood. Let's just say their roof is becoming very popular, too big for his britches community values." 32 people had liked the post. 12 had commented with various shades of agreement and mild outrage. Marcus felt sick reading it. She'd weaponized his neighborhood against him. He was the problem now, the guy with the fancy security system and the surveillance fetish, the one who couldn't handle kids playing. He thought about posting a response, setting the record straight, explaining what had actually been happening. He typed out 3 different versions and deleted all of them. Engaging would only escalate things further. He was learning that the truth was less important than the narrative, and Karen controlled the narrative. He called his friend Daniel that night. "She's turning the neighborhood against me," Marcus said without preamble. Daniel was a civil rights attorney, someone who understood conflict and its mechanics. "Don't engage, don't post, don't argue, just let it go. People think I'm the bad guy." "Some people will always think the bad guy is whoever they think the bad guy is," Daniel said, with the weariness of someone who dealt with countless character assassinations. "You are not going to convince a Facebook group that you're right. That's not how humans work." "So what do I do?" "Document everything. Keep it completely neutral, no commentary, no emotion, times, dates, incidents, and then you wait." "For what?" "For them to prove who they actually are. They always do." Marcus wanted to believe that. The alternative was accepting that he'd become a villain in his own neighborhood simply by having the audacity to object to having his privacy violated. The incidents with the car continued. Another keying, this time on the back bumper. His mailbox got knocked over. Someone left a note in his mailbox that said, "Stop harassing children," in letters cut from magazines. It was absurd, it was cartoonish, and it terrified him. He escalated too, though he told himself he was just being reasonable. He installed a gate on his back fence with a lock. He put up "no trespassing" signs in 3 places. He added motion sensor lights to the front of the house. He got Ring cameras for both doors. He changed the automatic locks on his windows to keyed locks. His house transformed into something that looked less like a home and more like a bunker. Thanksgiving came and went. Marcus spent it alone, having declined his parents' invitation to visit. He couldn't bring himself to explain what was happening. It sounded paranoid when he tried to articulate it. "My neighbor thinks I'm picking on her kids, so she's turned the whole neighborhood against me." It sounded like he was unstable, like he was the problem. The week before Christmas, he got a summons. It arrived by certified mail, and his hands were shaking so badly he could barely open the envelope. Karen Martinez was suing him for harassment, emotional distress, and inexplicably for creating a hostile living environment for children. The filing was thick, the language formal and intentional. She had a lawyer. Marcus read it 3 times, convinced he was misunderstanding something fundamental. The dates were wrong. She cited events that hadn't happened the way she described them. She included screenshots from the Facebook post using his security cameras, which she called surveillance equipment installed for the purpose of monitoring neighborhood children, as evidence of his obsessive behavior. He called Daniel at midnight. Daniel actually answered despite the hour, which told Marcus that his friend could hear the panic in his voice even through the phone. "This is bullshit," Daniel said after Marcus read him the relevant parts. "A SLAPP suit, strategic lawsuit against public participation. She's trying to intimidate you into backing off." "Is it going to work?" Marcus asked. "No, but it's going to cost you money. I'll recommend a litigation attorney, someone who handles this kind of thing." The litigation attorney was named Robert Sheffield, a man in his 60s with silver temples and the kind of calm that came from having spent his entire career watching people destroy themselves with anger. He reviewed the suit in his office, reading through it with the kind of expression people get when they're examining something distasteful. "This is crap," Sheffield said finally. "I mean it. This is a frivolous suit designed to harass you. We can motion to dismiss on multiple grounds, but she's going to keep escalating because she's already committed to the narrative." "What does that mean?" "It means she's told everyone she's suing you. It means she's painted herself as the victim and you as the predator. Walking back from that position would require admitting she was wrong, and people rarely do that. Usually they double down, get meaner, nastier, because backing down feels like losing." Marcus felt something hollow open in his chest. "So what do I do?" "You let me handle the legal stuff. You document everything. You don't engage with her kids, or your neighbors about this situation. You don't post on Facebook. You don't leave angry notes. You take the high ground and you hold it. And then," Sheffield said, meeting his eyes, "you wait for her to make a real mistake." "What kind of mistake?" "The kind that puts someone's safety actually at risk. Right now, everything she's done is annoying but technically defensible as parenting and neighborhood conflict. But people like her, they usually go too far. They push too hard. They cross a line they shouldn't cross." Marcus wanted to believe Sheffield. He wanted to believe that justice was a real force that operated in the universe, that people who acted in bad faith would eventually face real consequences. But he was starting to understand that the universe operated on different principles than he'd been taught. December turned gray and cold. The roof incident stopped, but Marcus wasn't relieved. He understood it now. The silence was tactical. Karen was biding her time. The lawsuit was still working its way through the court system. There were depositions scheduled, discovery requested. His life had become a legal proceeding. His parents called repeatedly. He told them everything was fine. They didn't believe him. Daniel came over on a Saturday afternoon, bringing beer and the kind of friendship that didn't require explanation. They sat in Marcus's kitchen, the cameras blinking their red lights all around them, and Daniel said what Marcus already knew. "You need to move." Marcus didn't respond for a long moment. Moving meant accepting defeat. It meant Karen had won. "I'm not moving," he said finally. "Then this is going to get worse," Daniel said with certainty. "She's established a narrative. She's got community support. She's got legal representation. You're in a position where the only winning move is the one you're refusing to make." "I've done nothing wrong." "I know that doesn't matter. Daniel took a drink of his beer. Fairness isn't real, man. Justice is real sometimes, but only when institutional authority backs it up. Right now, you're alone in a neighborhood that thinks you're the bad guy. That's a losing position. Marcus looked around his house. The cameras, the locks, the security system, all of it purchased in the name of protecting himself from a woman and her children. He thought about Karen, about how certain she must be that she was in the right, that her children were innocent victims of an obsessive neighbor. He thought about how comfortable that certainty must make her. Maybe, Marcus said quietly, everyone deserves to lose sometimes. He said it without entirely believing it, but the words hung in the air anyway, and neither of them tried to take them back. New Year's came and went without incident. Marcus celebrated alone, which he'd become accustomed to. The litigation was proceeding at the glacial pace of the legal system. Sheffield had filed the motion to dismiss. They were waiting for a ruling. In the meantime, Marcus's life had become something split down the middle. The daytime life where he worked and paid bills and pretended normality, and the nighttime life where he reviewed security footage and photographed rocks on his roof. He'd stopped calling the police. Officer Rivera had stopped coming out. The message delivered without words was clear. This was a civil matter now. They couldn't help. The neighbor to his right, the Hendersons, had basically disappeared. They didn't wave anymore. They kept their curtains drawn. Marcus suspected Karen had poisoned that well too, had probably explained her version of events at some HOA meeting or neighborhood gathering. The Hendersons were nice people who just wanted a quiet life, and Marcus represented the opposite of quiet. The neighbor to his left, the Kellers, had surprised him. Their teenage son had actually approached Marcus one afternoon while he was checking his mailbox. The kid, Brandon, who was probably 17, had looked at him with the kind of expression that suggested this conversation was costing him something socially. "My parents said I should stay out of this," Brandon had said without preamble. "But the stuff people are saying about you on Facebook is bullshit. I've seen Karen's kids on your roof, multiple times, so whatever." And then he'd walked away, leaving Marcus with a small thread of hope that maybe, somewhere, the truth mattered. The depositions were scheduled for late January. Marcus had to sit across from Karen's lawyer and answer questions about his security systems, his intentions, his mental state. The lawyer was younger than Sheffield, probably early 40s, and she approached Marcus the way a predator approaches prey, with the confidence of someone who believes they've already won. "Do you watch these camera feeds constantly?" she asked, gesturing to photographs of his camera installation that she'd blown up on a board. "I don't watch them constantly. I review them when an incident has occurred." "How often would you say an incident has occurred?" Sheffield had prepped him for these questions. "The appropriate response is to be precise and not admit to any exaggeration," he'd said. "Don't say frequently. Say 17 times if that's the number. Make them work for their narrative." "I have documentation of 19 trespassing incidents," Marcus said quietly. "Trespassing?" the lawyer repeated with a faint smile. "You consider children playing on a roof trespassing?" "I consider anyone being on my property without permission trespassing, yes, regardless of their age. Even though they're just kids, even though they're not damaging anything. They've damaged my sense of safety in my own home." The lawyer pounced on that. "Your sense of safety? In what way have these children made you unsafe?" And Marcus had to explain about the handprint on the window, the face pressed against the glass, the violation of being watched in his own bedroom. He had to articulate how vulnerability feels, and the lawyer made him seem paranoid for numbing it. When Karen testified, she cried. It was a performance, Marcus could see that, but it was a good performance. She talked about her children being frightened of their neighbor. She talked about the cameras and the locks and the way Marcus had escalated the situation. "He's the one who called the police," she said, her voice breaking. "About kids playing, who does that? What kind of person calls the police on children?" The courtroom, all 8 people in it, seemed to lean toward her. Marcus felt Sheffield tense next to him. But then it was Sheffield's turn, and he stood up with the kind of patience that suggested he'd been waiting for this. "Ms. Martinez," he said calmly, "did you post on your neighborhood Facebook group about Mr. Chen's roof becoming popular?" Karen's jaw tightened. "I might have made a joke." "That's yes. Did you encourage your children or children in your care to access Mr. Chen's roof?" "No, of course not." "So when your son tells his friends it's a dare to get on his roof, That's happening independently of your knowledge. Objection, KARENS' lawyer said, but the judge was already leaning forward with interest. What basis? Judge Patricia Whitmore was old, probably in her 70s, and she had the kind of face that suggested she'd seen all the ways human beings could hurt each other and was no longer surprised by any of it. He's putting words in her mouth. He's asking what she knows about her son's activities. That's fair game. Whitmore looked at KAREN. Answer the question. KAREN's eyes flickered to her lawyer, then back to Marcus. For just a moment, something true showed in her face, a calculation, a recognition that she'd gone too far. But then she recovered, and her face settled back into the mask of the wronged mother. My children are good kids, she said. If they've gone on your roof, it was just play, nothing more. And the way you've treated them, the surveillance, the police involvement, that's the real harassment here. The verdict came down in mid-March. Judge Whitmore dismissed KAREN's suit without prejudice, ruling that it was indeed a frivolous filing designed primarily to intimidate. Marcus was awarded his legal fees. It was a victory on paper, and Sheffield seemed satisfied with the outcome. But Marcus felt none of that satisfaction. The dismissal didn't erase the previous 4 months. It didn't change the narrative in the neighborhood. If anything, by going to court and losing, KAREN had only solidified her position as the victim of an unfair system. You won, Sheffield said when he delivered the news. Legally, you won completely. It doesn't feel like winning, Marcus said. Sheffield nodded like he'd heard this before. It rarely does in cases like this. The first week of April, Marcus noticed something new. His security camera footage showed KAREN and her children, along with what looked like a small group of other neighborhood kids, having a gathering in her backyard. Nothing unusual about that, except they were looking at his house. They were pointing. They were planning something. 3 days later, when Marcus wasn't home, someone spray-painted something on his garage door. It was obviously done by multiple people. The handwriting varied, the colors mixed. What they'd spray-painted was what made Marcus call 911 and then Sheffield and then sit on his front steps shaking. Child predator. Officer Rivera came out personally. She examined the graffiti with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been judgment. Marcus couldn't tell anymore. This is a hate crime, she said carefully. Vandalism with inflammatory language intended to incite harassment. I'm documenting it officially. We'll investigate, though I won't lie to you. Without clear footage of who did it, prosecution is difficult. She did it, Marcus said flatly. KAREN, she gathered people and they did it. Probably, Rivera agreed, but probably isn't proof. He filed a police report. He filed a countersuit against KAREN for defamation and harassment. Sheffield took the case, though he seemed less optimistic this time. This is escalating in ways I don't like, Sheffield said in his office, studying the photos Marcus had brought. She's crossed from civil into criminal territory, but in a way that's still somewhat deniable. Multiple perpetrators, lack of footage, inflammatory rhetoric that she can claim she didn't personally put on the wall. The police can investigate her, Marcus said. They can, they might. But she'll deny involvement, and without evidence directly linking her to the spray paint, it's going to be hard to prosecute. Marcus felt something break inside him, some last reservoir of faith in systems and fairness. So what do I do? Sheffield took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. It was a gesture Marcus hadn't seen before, a sign of actual exhaustion. You could press the police to investigate more thoroughly. You could file additional charges. You could continue the legal battle. You could, Sheffield said carefully. You could also consider moving. I know you don't want to hear that. But this is a woman who has repeatedly escalated, and she's now using your community as a weapon against you. She's created an environment where you're genuinely unsafe. I won't be driven from my home, Marcus said, and he meant it, and it was the most naive thing he'd said in months. Then prepare for this to get worse, Sheffield said, because that's what escalators do, they escalate. But Marcus was done being reasonable. He was done following the rulebook, checking boxes, trying to work within systems that clearly didn't care about justice or fairness. He was done being the person who handled conflict responsibly while KAREN played by rules she made up herself. He started documenting her specifically. He watched her patterns. He identified her car's license plate. He noted her schedule. He took the same obsessive approach he'd taken with the incidents and focused it directly on her, Not illegally, not in ways that crossed any real lines, but with an intensity that was probably obvious to anyone who looked closely. Because Marcus had finally understood something crucial. If Karen was going to be the villain in this story, he might as well know her schedule. The breaking point came in May. He was working at home, trying to focus on a project that absolutely required his attention, when his security camera footage showed Marcus SR pushing a ladder toward his house. Karen's husband, presumably, a man Marcus had never actually met. He was moving with purpose, moving with knowledge of exactly what he was doing. Marcus ran outside, his heart in his throat. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted. Senior looked at him with the kind of expression of someone who'd been given a role to play and was committed to playing it. "My wife said you've got something of hers up on your roof. I'm getting it." "There's nothing," Marcus started, but he saw it then. A toy soccer ball, battered and faded, sitting in the gutter of his roof. Not his toy, not something he'd ever seen before. "That's our kids," Senior said, and the casualness of the lie, the confidence with which he stated it, made Marcus understand something fundamental. There was no debate here. There was no negotiation. There was only a man with a ladder, a woman who told him to get their toy, and a narrative that everyone in the neighborhood had already agreed to believe. "You need to leave my property," Marcus said, but his voice sounded thin even to his own ears. Senior smiled, actually smiled, and started to climb the ladder. And Marcus, without really deciding to do it, without any plan beyond the moment, picked up the ladder and pulled it away. Senior fell, not far, maybe 8 feet, but it was enough. He landed hard on his back, the wind knocked out of him, unable to breathe for several terrible seconds before the air came rushing back into his lungs. He gasped and groaned and lay on the ground like something broken. The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes. The fire department came with them. They always did for the bigger calls. Marcus stood on his front porch and watched them load Marcus SR onto a stretcher. The man had regained consciousness and was cursing, his arm bent at an angle that suggested something was broken. Officer Patricia Rivera pulled up behind the ambulance, and when she got out of her car, she looked at Marcus with an expression that suggested she'd known this would end somewhere like this. "Tell me what happened," she said, and Marcus did. He told her about the ladder, about the toy, about the narrative that had become so powerful that a man was willing to climb up and take something from his roof on the word of a woman with a vendetta. "Did he threaten you?" Rivera asked. "No, he just came to get the toy," I panicked. "And you pulled the ladder?" "Yes." Rivera made notes, and somewhere in her expression Marcus saw a kind of defeat that matched his own. She knew. She'd always known how this would probably end in some variation of this scene. "I'm going to need you to come down to the station and make a formal statement," she said, "and I'm going to need to talk to the witnesses." There were no witnesses, Marcus realized. No one had seen it except him and Senior. And Senior was going to tell a very different version of events once he had a chance to coordinate with Karen about exactly what narrative would serve them best. The fire department, meanwhile, had become interested in his house. One of the firefighters, a woman in her 50s with salt gray hair, was looking at his roof, at his security cameras, at the locks and the gates and the general fortress-like quality of his home. She was talking to her partner, and Marcus caught fragments. Multiple incidents, kids, roof access. That's when it hit him. Karen hadn't been trying to get her toy back. This had been a setup. She'd put the toy on his roof so Senior would have a reason to come get it, so Marcus would do exactly what he'd done, so there would be an incident that was cleanly his fault in a way that all the other incidents weren't. The fire department hadn't arrived just by coincidence. They were there because Karen had called them. She'd constructed a scenario so clearly dangerous. An older man on a ladder, a homeowner with an established history of conflict, escalating tensions, that the fire department felt compelled to investigate the roof access situation. Marcus watched the firefighters take photos of the ladder, the roof, his security cameras. They were documenting the scene with the same professional detachment that Officer Rivera was using. They were creating a record. "Mr. Chen," one of the firefighters approached him. Her name tag said Captain Sarah Hendricks. "I need to ask you some questions about your roof access. We've received a complaint that there's been unauthorized access from neighborhood children, and I want to make sure there aren't legitimate safety concerns we need to address." "I've trimmed the tree," Marcus said. "I've installed cameras and locks." "I see that, but children have apparently been able to access the roof multiple times. How is that possible with your security measures in place? And Marcus understood then that he was being interrogated, that his security measures, which should have been obvious signs of legitimate concern, were instead being reframed as the sign of an obsessive. Why would a normal person install this many cameras? Why would a normal person care so much about kids playing? Why would a normal person feel compelled to physically prevent someone from accessing his roof? There are multiple ways to access a roof, Marcus said carefully. From the tree, from the fence, from other adjoining properties. But you've attempted to prevent those, Captain Hendricks noted. Multiple cameras, locks, even fishing line. I was trying to. I'm not making a judgment, Hendricks said, and she said it in a way that meant she absolutely was making a judgment. I'm trying to understand the security situation, because if there's a legitimate access point for children on a roof that's higher than, say, 15 feet, that's a fire code issue. That's something we need to address. She was reframing his concern about trespass as negligence about fire safety. It was brilliant in its way. She wasn't accusing him of anything. She was just asking questions. And those questions, documented officially, would become part of a record that painted him as someone who'd created a dangerous roof access situation. The next 2 hours were a masterclass in institutional authority being weaponized against someone. The firefighters documented the roof access, the height, the pitch angle. They photographed the cameras and made notes about excessive monitoring. They talked to him about roof safety, about liability, about the responsibility of a homeowner to prevent hazardous situations. By the time they left, it was late afternoon, and Marcus had a new reality. He was no longer just someone in conflict with his neighbor. He was someone whose roof had been officially flagged as a fire code concern. Officer Rivera had him come to the station at 6. The statement he gave was quiet and precise. Yes, he'd pulled the ladder. Yes, he'd been concerned about the trespassing. Yes, there had been previous incidents. No, he hadn't intended for Senior to fall. Yes, he understood that using physical force, even in defense of his property, had consequences. I'm going to refer this to the DA, Rivera said when the statement was done. They'll decide whether to charge you. My guess is they'll lean toward reckless endangerment, maybe a misdemeanor, but that's their call. And he's claiming I assault him, Marcus said. It wasn't really a question. His wife is. He hasn't made any official statement yet, but given what happened, I'd expect he will. Marcus went home to a house that felt smaller than it had that morning. He sat in his kitchen and called Sheffield, who listened to the entire story and then said something that Marcus would never forget. You're done, Sheffield said. Not your case, your time in this situation. KARENS has you now. She's manufactured a scenario where you're the clear aggressor and she's the victim. She's got fire department involvement, police involvement, hospital records showing her husband's injuries. She's won. I didn't do anything wrong. Yes, you did. You escalated when I told you not to. You let your emotions override your judgment. You pulled a ladder with a man on it. That's not nothing, Marcus. That's the thing that changes this from a civil dispute into a criminal matter. Marcus felt the walls of his house press in on him. What do I do? You hire a criminal defense attorney. You prepare for probable charges. And you accept that you're going to lose your house, either to legal fees or to moving away or to the genuine possibility of jail time. For pulling a ladder, Marcus said numbly. For pulling a ladder while standing in the middle of a neighborhood conflict you've been systematically documenting and escalating, Sheffield corrected gently. The narrative isn't, I defended my property. The narrative is, I physically attacked an older man over a toy. The criminal attorney Sheffield recommended was named Leslie Morrison, a woman in her 50s who specialized in self-defense and property crimes. She reviewed the incident with the same kind of analytical distance that Sheffield had used, treating it like a chess problem where all the pieces had already been moved. There's a video of the incident, Morrison said, from your security camera. Yes. Good, that's your best evidence, probably. It shows the context, the setup. But I'm going to tell you something you need to prepare for. The DA is going to press charges. Maybe not immediately, but they will. And when they do, you're going to face a trial where you look like someone who was crazy enough to pull a ladder from under someone. But I was protecting my property. And a prosecutor is going to ask, protecting it from what? A man trying to retrieve a toy, a child's toy, that's going to sound excessive to a jury. Marcus felt like he was drowning in a current he couldn't swim against. "What's my best-case scenario?" he asked. "Charges get dropped, case gets dismissed. You move away and try to build a new life somewhere that doesn't know your name," Morrison said flatly. "Worst case, you go to trial, get convicted, do time." For pulling a ladder. For pulling a ladder with disproportionate force during an escalating neighborhood dispute, Morrison corrected. "Appearance matters, narrative matters, and right now the narrative is not in your favor." The charges came down on a Tuesday in early June. Reckless endangerment, as Rivera had predicted, plus a misdemeanor assault charge. Marcus was told to appear in court in August. That gave him 2 months to prepare for the possibility of a trial or to work toward a plea deal that would allow him to avoid one. He sat in his house, the fortress he'd built to protect himself, and understood with absolute clarity that he'd lost. Not because KARENS was right or because justice had been served. Not because he'd done anything genuinely wrong, but because he'd been trapped in a system where narrative mattered more than truth, where escalation was rewarded, where a woman who'd violated his privacy and safety had won because she understood something fundamental that he hadn't: how to make the system itself her weapon. Marcus didn't attend the court hearings in person. He couldn't bring himself to sit across from KARENS to watch her perform victimhood while the system rubber-stamped her narrative. Instead, he let Morrison handle the negotiations, watching from a distance as his life was literally and figuratively dismantled. The plea deal came in July. He would plead to a reduced charge of misdemeanor assault, accept a year of probation, pay restitution for seniors' medical bills, nearly $14,000, and complete an anger management course. In exchange, the reckless endangerment charge would be dropped. He'd avoid prison. He'd just have a criminal record and a permanently altered life. The house sold in August to a young family who didn't ask many questions. Marcus took a small loss on the sale, eager to be rid of it, eager to erase himself from the neighborhood. He packed methodically, taking only what he needed, leaving behind a trail of memories that had been poisoned by proximity to KARENS. But before he left, something happened that would change everything. It started with a phone call from Officer Patricia Rivera. "There's been an incident," she said, her voice careful in a way that suggested she was choosing her words specifically for his reaction. "With KARENS' children on a roof." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "What kind of incident?" "I'm going to need you to come down to the station." The neighbor's house, not KARENS' house, but the one 2 doors down, a property that backed onto a small ravine, had a story that had started like so many others in this neighborhood. A child had accessed the roof. The child had fallen. The child was currently in intensive care at County General with a spinal cord injury and possible permanent paralysis. The child was 6 years old. Marcus sat across from Rivera in an interview room, and she placed a file on the table between them. "The child who fell is named Emma Martinez," Rivera said carefully. "KARENS' daughter. She and 2 other children were on a neighbor's roof, apparently as part of a dare that's been going around the neighborhood for months. The fall was approximately 20 feet. The child has a fractured vertebra, possible nerve damage. The doctors won't know the extent of the paralysis for several weeks." Marcus felt nothing for a moment, and then he felt something worse than nothing. He felt what might have been relief, followed immediately by guilt for feeling relief, followed by the sickening understanding that a child had been seriously hurt, and he could, theoretically, have prevented it. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked quietly. "Because you need to know what your concerns actually meant," Rivera said, and there was anger in her voice now, a real anger that had been building over the course of months. "You tried to tell us, multiple times. There was a dangerous situation, kids accessing roofs they shouldn't have been able to access, and the institutional response was to treat you like you were the problem." "What's KARENS saying?" Marcus asked. "She's initially claimed that the other kids pressured Emma into it, that she doesn't know how it happened, that the neighbor should have had better security. The usual." Rivera leaned back in her chair. "But the other kids have told a different story. They say KARENS encouraged them, that she thought it was funny, that she wanted them to keep doing it because it was a way to get at you." "Because of me," Marcus said flatly. "Because of you, because of the conflict. Because games can turn into dares and dares can turn into dangerous behavior, especially when children don't have responsible adults telling them that something is a bad idea." Marcus felt the weight of that settle on him. Not guilt, exactly, though there was some of that, but a kind of terrible clarity about how consequences worked, about how intentions mattered far less than outcomes. "Is there going to be a prosecution?" he asked. "Against Karen?" Rivera shook her head. "Negligent supervision, maybe, but proving that she actively encouraged a dangerous behavior versus just not discouraging it is different legally. There will probably be a CPS investigation, but criminal charges, unlikely." "So she gets away with it?" "She has a daughter who might be permanently paralyzed," Rivera said, her voice hard. "I don't know if I'd call that getting away with it." 2 weeks after the conversation with Rivera, Marcus received a letter. It was from a lawyer he didn't recognize, representing Karen Martinez. Inside was an apology of sorts, not for what she'd done to Marcus, but for the role her actions might have played in the accident. She was offering a settlement, a substantial one, acknowledging that her conduct had contributed to a dangerous environment. The amount was impressive, $200,000. It was, Marcus recognized, her version of desperation. It was the money equivalent of admitting that she'd gone too far, that her vendetta had metastasized into genuine danger. He didn't accept the settlement. He didn't respond to the letter. He had no interest in being the recipient of Karen's conscience clearing. Instead, he did something that surprised himself. He called the family of one of the other children who'd been on the roof, a boy named Tommy whose parents were probably considering litigation. "You should know what really happened," Marcus said to Tommy's mother, Linda. "Not just about the accident, but about the culture that created it." He told her about the footprints, about the Facebook posts, about Karen's encouragement of the behavior. He gave her copies of his documented incidents, his security footage, everything that had previously been dismissed as obsessive, but now, in the context of a seriously injured child, became evidence of a real problem that had been ignored. Tommy's mother listened, with the kind of intensity that suggested this conversation was changing her calculation about something important. "I was going to settle," she said when he finished. "Get it over with, but now I think we might pursue this further." "I'm not asking you to do that," Marcus said quickly. "I know you're not, but the fact that you told us that you risked more of your own problems by testifying or cooperating or whatever you end up doing, that matters. That says something about who you are." The litigation that followed Karen happened without Marcus's direct involvement, but his documentation became central to it. The other families sued Karen for her role in creating a dangerous environment, for encouraging behavior she knew to be unsafe. CPS opened a formal investigation. Karen's other children were temporarily removed from her custody while the investigation proceeded. The public narrative shifted. The Facebook group that had supported Karen's campaign against Marcus turned their attention to Karen instead. The evidence of her role in encouraging the children to access roofs, combined with the serious injury that had resulted, made her the villain in a story that could no longer be rewritten. Marcus learned all of this secondhand, from Linda and from news articles that appeared in the local press. He didn't attend any of the proceedings. By the time the legal consequences came due, he was already living in a new city, in an apartment on the 13th floor of a building where he knew no one and had constructed no narrative. But he couldn't entirely escape the story. 6 months after he'd moved, he received a call from Officer Rivera. "I thought you'd want to know," she said. "Karen attempted suicide 2 days ago. She's in the hospital now, psychiatric hold. She tried to overdose on her husband's pain medication." Marcus sat with that information for a long moment, and then he hung up the phone and didn't think about Karen Martinez for several months. When he did think about her again, it was because of a letter that arrived at his forwarding address. It was from Emma Martinez, Karen's daughter. The letter was handwritten, the script a child's careful printing, and it said, "Dear Mr. Chen, my therapist said I should write to people involved in my situation to help with my healing. I'm writing to you because my mother said you were the person who made her so upset that she made bad decisions. But my therapist said that's not how responsibility works. My therapist said I made my own choice to go on the roof. My mother made her own choices. You made your own choices. Nobody made anybody do anything. I am paralyzed from the waist down because of my choice. That is on me, not on you. I hope you can forgive my mother. I am still working on that." From Emma Martinez, age 7. Marcus read the letter 3 times and then he wept, not for himself and not for Karen, but for a child who'd learned responsibility and consequence too early, who'd been forced to mature in a way that no child should have to. He read the letter again and understood something he hadn't before, that the story was never really about right or wrong, about winners and losers, about justice or its absence. It was about people making choices that had consequences, and consequences that rippled outward in ways no one could entirely predict or control. 3 years later, Marcus had built something resembling a normal life. He worked for a software company in a mid-sized city 2 hours away from his old neighborhood. He had an apartment that was small and efficient and required no security measures beyond a basic lock on the door. He'd started dating again, cautiously, with the kind of wariness that comes from having been burned by intimacy of any kind. The lawsuit with Karen had been settled confidentially. Tommy's family had reached a settlement that included an admission of negligence on Karen's part and a commitment to fund Emma's medical care and therapy indefinitely. The other families had settled on similar terms. Karen had been ordered to pay substantial damages, and her homeowner's insurance had footed the rest. She'd lost custody of her children. They were living with her ex-husband, Marcus S.R., who'd recovered fully from the broken arm. Emma was in physical therapy, making incremental progress toward recovery, but ultimately facing the reality that she would likely never walk again. Karen was living alone in her house, required to pay child support and ongoing medical expenses, her life reduced to a kind of penance that no legal system could actually enforce or measure. Officer Patricia Rivera had retired from the police force. Marcus had learned this secondhand, from a news article about her going into private security. He'd wanted to thank her, to somehow acknowledge that she'd been one of the few people in the situation who'd actually tried to tell the truth, but he never found the right words or the right moment. Sheffield, his initial civil attorney, had passed away suddenly from a heart attack. His law firm sent Marcus a notice about case closure and a final billing statement. Leslie Morrison, his criminal attorney, had sent him a Christmas card the first year and then nothing after that. The legal system had moved on, absorbing his case into its vast archive of disputes and resolutions and problems solved or merely postponed. But the letter from Emma had changed something in Marcus's understanding of the entire situation. He'd come to see it not as a conflict that had been won or lost, but as a cascade of choices and consequences that had all been set in motion the moment he'd taken those first photographs of muddy footprints on his roof. If he'd simply trimmed the tree and said nothing, if he'd absorbed the violation instead of resisting it, would Emma still be able to walk? Maybe. Probably. But that kind of thinking led to paralysis, and the image made him grimace at his own unintended wordplay. The truth was that Karen would have probably escalated anyway. The children would have found another way onto another roof. The institutional failures, the police department treating it as too small to matter, the fire department reframing his legitimate safety concerns as obsessive behavior. Those failures weren't Marcus's responsibility. But they were part of the system, and the system had failed everyone. What he'd learned was this: narrative matters more than truth, but only for a while. Eventually, reality has a way of asserting itself. Emma's paralysis was a reality that no narrative could rewrite. The consequences of Karen's actions were real in a way that social media posts and Facebook groups could never be. The night before what would have been the 5-year anniversary of the day he first discovered those muddy footprints, Marcus opened his laptop and searched for current news from his old neighborhood. The search returned some results: a recent property sale, a new development proposal, a Facebook post about holiday decorations, and then, almost buried, a small article from the local news. Woman charged in connection with neighbor's hit-and-run death. His heart stopped. He read the article carefully. A woman named Karen Martinez had allegedly hit a man with her car and fled the scene. The man had been walking in the neighborhood. He'd sustained serious injuries. He was currently in the hospital but expected to recover. The police were still investigating. Marcus clicked on the linked photo and saw her. Older than he remembered, face gaunt, eyes hollow. She looked like someone who'd been hollowed out from the inside. He closed the laptop and didn't open it again that night. The next day, he received a call from Linda, Tommy's mother. They'd stayed in occasional contact over the years, a kind of friendship born from shared trauma. "Did you see the news?" Linda asked. "About KARENS. She hit someone. Did you hear who?" "The article said it was a neighbor, but they didn't name him." "It was Robert Sheffield," Linda said quietly, "the lawyer who originally represented you." Marcus felt the world tilt slightly. Sheffield. He was visiting the neighborhood, apparently, showing properties to a client, and Karen hit him with her car, just hit him like she was aiming. Is he? He's going to be okay. Broken legs, internal injuries, but he'll survive. But Marcus, the police are saying it looks intentional, like she targeted him specifically. Marcus sat with that information, trying to process it. Sheffield had ruled against her in some capacity, had represented Marcus against her. And now, years later, in a neighborhood where she'd already lost her children and her reputation and any sense of normalcy, she'd allegedly driven her car into a man who represented a symbol of her failure. She's going to prison, Linda said. This time for real, there's no narrative that gets her out of this. After he hung up with Linda, Marcus thought about Karen, not with satisfaction or vindication, but with a kind of exhausted sadness. She'd been so committed to a narrative of victimhood that she'd become unable to see how her own actions were creating the very reality she was fighting against. He thought about Emma, now 10 years old, going through life in a wheelchair because her mother had wanted to punish her neighbor by encouraging a dangerous game. He thought about how consequences worked, how they accumulated, how they metastasized when people refused to accept responsibility for the outcomes they created. And he thought about his own role in it all, not with guilt, but with an understanding that he'd been one part of a system that had failed everyone. He'd tried to do the right thing. He'd documented evidence, called the police, worked through legal channels. But he'd also let his anger override his judgment, had also been willing to escalate in pursuit of validation and vindication. No one in this story had been purely right or purely wrong. Everyone had chosen escalation over de-escalation. Everyone had been convinced of their righteousness, and everyone had lost something that they couldn't get back. 3 weeks later, Marcus received another letter. This one was from a lawyer representing Karen's estate. She'd been denied bail, the charges were serious, and facing trial and likely prison time, she'd apparently decided that continued living wasn't an option. She'd taken her own life in her cell, 2 weeks into her incarceration. The letter explained that she'd left some instructions in her will. One of them involved a trust fund for Emma's ongoing medical care and therapy. Another involved a donation to a nonprofit that worked with children who'd been injured due to parental negligence. And the third involved a detailed, written apology to Marcus, to Sheffield, to the families involved in the lawsuit, to Officer Rivera, and to Emma herself. Marcus didn't read the apology. He filed it away in a folder labeled closed and never looked at it again. Instead, he made a donation in Karen's name to the same nonprofit, not as a gesture of forgiveness, but as a statement of refusal. He refused to let this story define his life. He refused to be the man who'd lost his home to a neighbor's vendetta. He refused to be the man whose reasonable concerns had escalated into crisis. He would be the man who'd learned, eventually, that the most important victory was simply being able to walk away. 5 years after Marcus had left his neighborhood, he returned to it, but not for the reasons he would have expected. He was in the area for work, a software implementation at a hospital 2 miles from his old street. It was a coincidence, or maybe it wasn't. Either way, when he finished his work that day, he found himself driving through the neighborhood, the muscle memory of geography pulling him back. The houses hadn't changed much. The trees were taller, some lawns were better maintained, some worse. The Hendersons' house had a sold sign in the yard. Someone had painted the house next to where KARENS had been. The corner store was still there, still selling milk and bread and lottery tickets to people who believed in luck. He didn't drive past KARENS' house. He didn't need to. Instead, he drove to the park at the edge of the neighborhood and parked his car. There was a playground there, newly renovated since he'd left. New equipment, fresh paint, well-maintained. And on a bench near the playground, he saw someone in a wheelchair. He recognized her immediately, Emma Martinez. Older now, maybe 12, with her mother's blonde hair and something of her mother's intensity in her expression. She was watching the other children play, a look on her face that was complicated, part longing, part acceptance, part something else that Marcus couldn't quite name. He almost left without approaching her. But then he thought about the letter she'd written him, about responsibility and choice and the difference between blame and consequence. He walked over and sat on the bench next to her. "You probably don't remember me," he said quietly. She looked at him and recognition flickered across her face. "You're the roof man, Mr. Chen." "Marcus is fine." Emma, she said, and then with the directness of a child who'd learned truth through tragedy, I'm paralyzed because my mom was mean to you. My therapist says I've spent a lot of therapy time forgiving her for that, but I've done it. I'm okay now. Marcus didn't know what to say to that. A child had somehow achieved what an adult man with legal resources and time and anger couldn't: actual forgiveness. Are you okay? Emma asked. And it was such a genuine question, asked with such simple compassion, that Marcus felt something crack open inside his chest. I'm getting there, he said finally. They sat in comfortable silence, watching children play on equipment that was safe and regulated and designed to prevent the kind of accident that had changed both their lives. My dad says it wasn't your fault, Emma said eventually. He says it wasn't anybody's fault really, just a thing that happened. But my mom made choices that made the thing more likely to happen, and I made a choice to go on the roof, and you made choices about protecting your property, and all the choices put together made it so I fell. That's a lot of wisdom for 12, Marcus said. I've had a lot of therapy, Emma said with a small smile. They make you really think about stuff. When he left the park, Emma was still there on her bench, watching the children, and Marcus drove away with the understanding that sometimes the most important people in a story are the ones who suffer enough to actually learn something from it. He thought about KARENS, about the choices she'd made from a place of such absolute certainty, such unwillingness to see any perspective but her own. He thought about how that certainty had compounded and spiraled until it had consumed her entirely. And he thought about himself, about how he'd let his anger override his judgment, about how he'd wanted vindication more than he'd wanted peace, about how the system had rewarded his documentation and escalation instead of his attempts at resolution. The story of the roof didn't have an ending that fit neatly into any narrative. There was no closure, no justice, no clear victor. There was only the aftermath, the debris field of lives that had been altered by choices made in anger, by narratives that had been weaponized, by a system that had failed to prevent tragedy until tragedy was already inevitable. But there was also this: Marcus had survived. Emma would survive, and perhaps more importantly, she would thrive. Sheffield had recovered. The other children had grown past their dare and their youthful stupidity. And somewhere in a system that demanded reckoning with the consequences of actions, KARENS had faced herself and found herself wanting. That wasn't justice exactly, but it was real. And for a man who'd learned that narrative mattered more than truth, that escalation was usually rewarded, that systems failed more often than they succeeded, the reality of genuine consequence, even painful, messy consequence, was almost worth it.